indeed, and it's one in which there appears to be no definitive answer, such as it is. Whilst the Canadians managed to redeem themselves somewhat in the later rounds of the draft, with picks such as Joshua Waugh and Xavier Simoneau, free agency is really where GM Marc Bergevin and his staff came to play, making players such as Mike Hoffman and David Savard, among others. Who in your mind is your favorite free agent addition from the Canadians? Is there any you're more skeptical about?
I don't know if I have a favorite. I will say that I'm most intrigued about the Mike Hoffman signing, only because of the fact that he provides the goal scoring. And I think if you look at the wings now for the Montreal Canadiens, I've heard people say it's the strongest that they've seen in quite some time. And I think I'm going to co-sign that as well. I don't think I know this is a team that's lost Thomas Tatar. That was a top line winger for this team, but they're in a position now where you're looking at the depth chart. You could totally see the Canadiens say, okay, we could put Tyler Toffoli on the top left wing, for example, or Mike Hoffman can go there as well. I believe he can play left and right wing, and as can Tyler Toffoli. Like, we're talking about a team that has some options on the wing. It's just the center that's just a big question mark. So I think he's probably up there for me in terms of ones I'm skeptical about. I'm not sure if I have one that's like really skeptical, but I guess the biggest one, I guess that kind of counts, might be David Savard, only because he's clearly the defense signing that hopefully will try to fill the Shea Weber void that's there. But the reason why I can't put him as completely skeptical, I still think it's a good signing. I still think he's going to eat up some minutes. I think he'll be like a decent top four defenseman. That being said, he's closest enough to that label that we're throwing out there, only because I don't think he's going to be nearly as feared as Shea Weber was with the Montreal Canadiens. Weber is coming off probably his best set of playing with the Canadiens over in the playoffs. And I'd be surprised if David Savard was anywhere near that threshold of play. So I guess that counts, but I also think the David Savard signing was really good. But I think I'm a little bit higher on the Mike Hoffman one, only because of the goal scoring that he's able to provide for the Canadiens.
I think in my mind, there's nobody who can really replace Shea Weber for the Canadiens on the blue line. He's their big de facto leader. And to chime in a little bit here, free agency was my personal favorite part of the offseason, and I definitely found it painted the Canadiens in a better light as compared to the entry draft. It sort of made up for it in any fashion you would. Yet, just as things were beginning to look up, however, another bombshell was dropped in the form of Jesperi Kotkaniemi. The background behind the off-discussed offer sheet is one which with many sides to it, but from a hockey perspective, you think the Canadiens are losing a lot with Kotkaniemi's departure?
I'll say that I think the Canadiens we'll never really know what the Canadiens are really going to lose in Jesperi Kotkaniemi. I think we'll see him do his thing in Carolina. I still think he's going to be in a really good situation over there with the fact that he's not in an environment that cares about hockey like all the time. He's around some really talented players in Carolina as well. And, him playing on the third line in that organization, I don't think is going to be a death sentence, but I know some people are going to think about the fact he's making all that money. I think the fact that the Canadiens mishandled Jesperi Kotkaniemi, they rushed him into the National Hockey League when he was a bit too young. They should have let him stay in Finland, or they should have let him play AHL hockey a lot longer than they did. Because of the fact they didn't do all those things, we'll never really know in this city in Montreal what this team really had in him. And Carolina will likely reap whatever rewards are there. But I think the fact that Marc Bergevin at least acquired Christian Dvorak, a guy who will play top 6 minutes. No one has to worry about whether or not he is a center, a guy who Bergevin was describing as a responsible, honest guy, 200-foot game, can play on penalty kill. Like, even though he's not a draft, he's not nearly as young as Kotkaniemi is. Sorry, he's older. He's a little closer to his prime than Kotkaniemi is. I think if he does at least decently well, that'll at least soften the blow for a lot of Canadiens fans.
I think obviously losing Kotkaniemi kind of points to how poor the Habs draft record has been over the past few seasons. But leading on from that, there's actually some really talented prospects in Matthias Norlinder and Kaden Guhle who are coming through this development camp who seem to have NHL futures. With Kotkaniemi's rush development in mind, being thrown into the NHL at 18, how do you think the Habs should handle Norlinder and Guhle? Do you think they should give them NHL shots right off the bat or let them develop?
No, they shouldn't. Just like off the Kotkaniemi answer, and I understand that playing center and defense are two different positions, but those two players in particular, Norlinder and Guhle, could represent the future for this franchise. And I think this organization should do everything they can to ensure that they're not rushed and they're brought into the National Hockey League at a good time, especially Norlinder, who I understand that, it's either he plays in the NHL or he goes out to play another year in Sweden as a team in Sweden has his rights. just let him do that. Let him go play out in Sweden for more time, and instead of just having him stay as like a seventh defenseman and not get that much time, just let him play out in Sweden and just let him develop for another year. I don't see why that will hurt. And for a guy like Caden Gooley, I think it's no question that he'll still he won't be with the Canadiens lineup. Let him go play with the World Juniors. A lot of people are saying that he'll likely end up being captain of this year's coming team for Canada. So let him go through that experience before the team inevitably decides, you know what, we'll sign him to an ELC like next year. So yeah, I think the Kotkaniemi thing, not to go back on that, but in that press conference, Marc Bergevin was asked about his handling, and he acknowledged that, you know what, he has kind of learned some things about it and maybe realized that letting him stay in Finland might have been a better idea. And he did also acknowledge that with the way he's kind of handled guys like Ryan Poehling and Cole Caulfield, like maybe it's a little better just to kind of just wait and see just a little bit. So you're getting that sense that the Canadiens in some sense have learned from that. And I imagine that philosophy might continue with these defensive prospects in Norlinder and Gooley going forward.
I guess you can truly say that hindsight is 2020 when it comes to this kind of stuff sometimes. Going back to what you said earlier about Christian Dvorak and the Habs' latest acquisition of him. Dvorak obviously played for one of the most offensively weak teams in the NHL in the Coyotes, and one who have a very grim future ahead of them. What if their arena lease not being renewed? Do you think Dvorak can finally find his offensive groove in Montreal? And do you feel as though, going back to what you said about Kotkaniemi, do you feel as though it's truly a suitable replacement for him, or maybe even an improvement?
I'll say this, while the Dvorak trade softens the blow of losing Kotkaniemi because the Canadiens have a slightly better center than him, you could also say that Dvorak is more of a replacement for Philip Deneau, who he was the best defensive center on the team. And I'm inclined to believe with the way the depth chart looks now, Dvorak will likely be the team's best defensive center. What will that mean for his point production? Well, that we might end up getting a guy who might be slightly better only because of the line mates that he has around him. Like last season in particular, he was playing most of his minutes, I think, with like Lawson Krause and Tyler Pitlick. On this team, there's a chance he might be playing with like Jonathan Drouin, like Brendan Gallagher. And I mean, I know Jonathan Drouin hasn't played in a few months, but I'm willing to bet that him and Gallagher are a significant upgrade on Lawson Krause and Tyler Pitlick. That's no disrespect to those two players. But it all depends on how he's deployed against some of the best centers in the Atlantic Division and some of the other guys in the rest of the league, right? Because this is a guy who, especially in his time in Arizona, spent a lot of time going up against guys like Ante Kopitar and other great centers in the Western Conference. So he knows what it's like to go up against some of the best in the league. I'll say that his points will go up slightly. It really depends on how the Canadiens are doing and how he's really being deployed against some of these other big centers. Like an Austin Matthews comes to mind, for example. We'll see if they ever get matched up against each other. I could see him as a guy who kisses 50 points. This is a guy who I think has had below 40 since he's gotten to the National Hockey League. I can see him flirting with 50 points heading into this coming season.
I think that Dvorak will bring some of the experience that Kotkaniemi hasn't quite brought to Montreal yet. But finally, just for a bit of general overview, there's a lot of anticipation regarding the 2021-22 season, both for Canadiens fans and the NHL in general. Return to full attendance in Canadian arenas, a new team in the Seattle Kraken, so on and so forth. Considering what Montreal managed last season and with the new acquisitions and multiple changes over the course of this offseason, how do you think they'll perform in a return to their old division? Where do you see them come next season?
I see them fighting for a playoff spot. And if you talk to, and I'm sure if you look at the composition of this team, I've seen people say like, oh, you know, with the way that this division looks, like the Canes are not going to make the playoffs. And I remember one person in particular saying, like, man, this is a year they should just like punt it. Like this roster is composed of these are guys who are going to try to make the playoffs. Like you don't go and have the free agent frenzy you had last year and then go into this year after you made the Stanley Cup final and say like, you know what, man, like, nah, like we're going to tank this year. There's going to be like 4 playoff spots for like 5 teams essentially in that division. And like Tampa, Boston, Florida, and Toronto and Montreal are all, I think those are going to be the teams that are really going to be like competing hard. Right. So yeah, I think that, I think with the way that this is going to go, I see the Canadiens fighting. I see them going for a wild card spot. I can see them as a wild card team, honestly, but I also think it might depend on one of those other teams I mentioned compete for a playoff spot, also kind of sucking. And it's not impossible. Like the Bruins are going to take a step back. The Leafs, I know they're going to be, a lot of people are seeing them as a good regular season team, but they're like I think they're a really bad skid away from everything kind of falling off the wheels and panic just really setting in.
Especially with Zach Hyman being gone.
Yeah, right. And Florida as well. Like, that's a team that a lot of people are high on. If Sergei Bobrovsky isn't handling it in net, like, that might hurt them a little bit. But I also
think he has in past seasons.
That's true, but they also have Spencer Knight, another young goaltender who, he's looked okay in the few moments that he's been in the goal, but that's a lot to put on him if they have to rely on him for games if Bobrovsky can't handle the job, especially at his salary. But all that to say, like, I'm still high on the Panthers, but I think the Canadians, they'll have to play well themselves, but I'm also thinking there's some team ahead of them that has to really underwhelm for them to make the playoffs this year. But they'll be there. They'll be fighting. I don't see them as a really bad team. I think they'll be a team that could fight to make the playoffs. And if they make the playoffs, you could just throw out any prognostications at that point, even though we'll still make them anyway, because anything could really happen.
I think that's definitely a thing that's attributed to the NHL, is that anything can happen in the regular season and especially in the playoffs. I mean, we saw it with the Canadians last postseason. But going back to what we said about Weber earlier and going about what you said about the Canadians fighting for a playoff spot, obviously losing Weber and losing a playoff spot, obviously the Canadians will be missing a lot of captaincy and leadership with Weber's departure and possible retirement. With only assistants coming into the next season, who do you think will be able to replace Weber in that leadership role going into 2021-22?
I don't know if there's anyone on that team that could really replace him. It's probably going to be one of those leadership by committee things. The good thing is that through guys like a Brendan Gallagher and other guys who have had those lengthy cup runs before joining the Canadiens, like a Joel Edmonton, for example, and of course, Carey Price being there. Everyone kind of follows Carey Price's lead. It's not as if the Canadiens are going to be short on experience and some sort of leadership in that locker room. But it is clear that Shea Weber was that figurehead atop that kind of led everybody. So I think they'll miss him in some ways, but I think we're not talking about a roster filled with young and experienced players who are just trying to figure it out. These are guys who there's a decent blend of youth and experience, and they all went through a Stanley Cup final together. Like, I think everyone who was on that team will have come away with some experience and some more hair on their chest. Which is weird to say, but you get what I mean. So I think even if they won't have a guy like Shea Weber in the locker room, I think the fact that they'll have guys with some experience and some sort of leadership there, I just don't see them being a team that's going to be completely lost in that department.
I definitely agree with you on that one. Well, Julian, as always, it was a pleasure to speak with you regarding the Canadians, the inner workings of their lineup, and everything in between. For our listeners back at home, where can they find you across this vast-reaching internet landscape?
Oh yeah, man! This godforsaken internet. Twitter is where you can normally find me, JKA McKenzie. That's the Twitter handle. Be on the lookout, man. Got some cool stuff coming up with The Athletic and all my other podcasts and stuff like Yahoo Sports and the Waterboys podcast and a few other cool things that I can't really mention right now. So yeah, give me a follow on Twitter at JKA McKenzie.
As always, Julian, thanks for coming on our show, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. Mr. Patrick Lorty, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, Scott, for the wonderful interview. That was actually really, really interesting. And now we are going to talk about Jonathan Drouin. Now, at the moment of this recording, the interview just aired, literally like a few seconds ago, and we had the chance to catch the glimpses and whatnot, and of course the big quotes and everything. And the general consensus now is that, well, it's not a general consensus. This is what Drouin said specifically. He's been suffering from anxiety. Is what has been happening, and to a point where it's been affecting him mentally, it's been affecting him physically. It was reported as early as this morning that he's having bouts of insomnia, which is a horrible thing to bout, whether you're an athlete or not. And then he specifies, like, listen, I'm 26 years old, and I need to take care of myself, and that's what he did. So he took time off, fully knowing the playoffs are right around the corner. And you know, I say more power